For you.
It's good afternoon for me and good evening for you, sir.
Very nice. We've been looking forward to talking to you for a long time now.
Me too. My,
Um,
I'm honored.
so there are so many things we can talk about, but let's start with something that you are, of course, an expert about and wrote a book about, and it's about
Uh-huh.
mastery.
Yes.
So, what is mastery? What? Why do we care?
Well, mastery is kind of, it's very hard to put into words. It's more like a feeling or sensation that you have, but you reach a certain level in your field. It could be science, it could be business, it could be the arts, where you have a feel, you have an intuition for what you're doing, for what should come next. And you don't even have to think. You don't even have to go through a process that most people have to go to. Ideas come to you out of nowhere. And I've always been fascinated by this because I sensed it in certain writers that I love very much, in certain musicians and composers that I admire, and in other people that I've even met in my life. And the problem is that it's surrounded by with all these myths and mystifications, as
Correct.
if it's something that you're born with, as if someone is a born genius or if they're born with talent. But what I wanted to do in mastery is show that it's actually very logical. It comes through a process that we can discuss and that we can analyze. And
Exactly.
I show this very simple path that gets you there. And I compare it to, like, music is a very good example, but also we can talk a lot about chess and great chess masters. And I read a lot about, like, Bobby Fischer, for instance. And what he said is, at that level of mastery, the chessboard is like internalized. It's inside of him. He's living it in the moment. And I read the same thing about Glenn Gould when he was actually performing some Bach or whatever. That the music is alive. It comes from within. He doesn't have to think anymore. So I wanted to show the reader how you could achieve that. It's not about your education or where you were born or who your parents are. It's about your dedication and your love, and if you're willing to go through that process.
I have. I totally identify with what you're saying, but I must say that this process doesn't matter how one tries to calibrate it or sort of work and process it. It's an enigmatic journey. It is not.
Yeah.
It's a for a musician. If you talk about if I talk about myself, for example, I still don't know always, and I doubt, is it? Do I really know this well enough? And but one of the things that I can tell you, that now that I've been actually conducting orchestras over 30 years, there has some, maybe a year ago or 2 or 3 ago, some little nuance has changed. Somehow I felt, well, I know how to do this now. I might not know the text of this particular piece yet very well, but I know what it is, and because of all the other pieces and all the other things that you need to go through to get there, somehow you have a feeling like, well, that's the way it's done. It's almost impossible to exactly
Yes, I know.
identify, but you know something that you didn't know before. You have this feeling that you know something that you didn't know before, even though before you thought you knew everything very well anyway. But somehow there is a nuance, and I don't. That's why this is such a interesting subject. This whole thing about mastery. 10,000 hours. Tell me about that.
Well, that was a study that was done by a Swedish man in the 90s named Ericsson. And he wanted to see if there were some common patterns, people who have extremely successful. And his first fields that he looked at were music and chess, because he could literally count the hours that people had spent in practicing to get to a certain point. And you could actually say that somebody is a chess master. It's very obvious. He or she has won so many matches. You can say somebody is a master composer because of the incredible success he or she has had with his compositions. And he discovered an incredibly bizarre and interesting thing, which was that almost in every single case, at the point that someone reached 10,000 hours of practice, and that meant, starting from the very beginning when you first took up chess or when you first took up a music of the violin, those first hours as a child, for instance, and counting all of those hours. And when you reached a point of 10,000, something happened. Suddenly, people playing chess became much more creative. They weren't simply following patterns that they had internalized. They were now creating new patterns, making moves that no one had ever made before. So suddenly, like for instance, Mozart has always been pointed as someone who kind of breaks that rule. I mean, here he was at the age of 16 composing things that were actually quite sophisticated. But this man went back and proved that starting at the age of 3 or 4, he was putting in those 10,000 hours because he was practicing night and day at the age of 4. So he found one exception to the 10,000 hour rule in music, and that was Dmitri Shostakovich, who composed his first symphony after approximately 9,000 hours. And Shostakovich's first symphony is actually quite brilliant. It's very bizarre because he's saying that what happens at 10,000 hours is there's so many connections that the brain has made. It's internalized so many things that it can now operate on a higher level. And I'm sorry.
It's interesting that one can actually put a number to it, because when you start thinking about the process that one has to go through in different discipline, the process is so unique to that discipline. For example, a violinist who doesn't start by the age of 4 or 5 will never be a professional violinist or in a professional world. And meanwhile, a singer can't even start learning voice before the voice has developed, which is somewhere after 20. So and so on. So how does one count 10,000? But that's a very interesting theory. Basically, it's work. But I mean, how does one really find that number? That's fascinating.
Well, the other thing is, people have asked me, well, I'm 60 years old and I have been painting since I was 10 years old. So I've obviously done the 10,000 hours, but I am not Van Gogh. I am not Cezanne. What happened to me? And the answer is that those 10,000 hours have to occur within a certain time frame. In other words, if you spend 50 years accumulating, it won't be the same. It's a function of the intensity. And the younger you start, the better it is, because when you're younger, your mind is fresh, and all those connections, all those patterns that you're internalizing, they get more deeply rooted in the brain. So it's not just the 10,000 hours. There are a few other factors. It's also the quality of your practice as well.
Right. But also the level of talent, and also a level of affinity with whatever you do. I know a lot of people who practice and are incredibly hard workers, but they are not. They just don't. They're not made for that field. They are not made for. They're not right for being violinists. They might be fantastic and something else, but enormous amount of work has made them come up to a certain level. But other than that, they're helpless. They cannot go through that barrier with all the work.
Do you think that has to do with the fact that they're internally, they're not as connected to it, they're not as deeply in love with it as somebody else is? It's not as emotional for them.
Well, I don't know. I have a feeling that we all are talented, but we are not always lucky enough to find our right field.
That's right.
Because for so many people, there are parents who will lead you into a certain direction, and or parents who will say, you have to be a lawyer, you have to be a doctor because that's the good thing, and your father was, and your grandfather was a doctor, and so but and you go to a law school or a medical school, but it's not your thing. You're not you're not wired in a way that would make you a good doctor. So you need to find the thing that is right for you. Otherwise, 10,000 or 100,000 hours of practice
Right.
is going to be useless, I suppose.
I agree. Well, how about with you? Because you come from a musical family. I've noticed that with a lot of people who I consider masters, who I wrote about in the book, in their childhood, and they're 4 or 5 years old, they had a moment where they were so deeply attracted to either writing or words or music or math that it showed early on. Did you have that kind of thing, or was it something that was just because of your family?
For me, it was I suspect also for my brother and sister, it was something that I never had to think about what do I want to do in my life, with my life, because it was somehow by the time you started thinking about it, it was already too late. We were already too far along. But what was absolutely clear is that one person, and that was my father, who was able to make us fall in love with music. It wasn't a question of falling in love with practicing or learning certain things. No, it was actually quite opposite. It was fun. It was a game. It was always exciting. It was always challenging. But it was okay. What is this? Who is playing? Which do you know where the composer was born? Do you know which time period? Do you know? Is it romantic? Is it baroque? Is it Russian? Is it German? Could it be English? This kind of thing, and you become so good at guessing things because there are little things that you learn every time. I remember when he played something, and he said, "Which composer is that?" And we had no idea. And then he said one thing: he said, "If you don't know this, that means you have never in your life heard any music by that composer." Because once you've heard even 10 bars of music by this composer, you would always recognize it. And he was talking about Prokofiev.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he's right. If you
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
listen to Prokofiev, you cannot possibly mix it up with anything else. It is just a language so incredibly unique and harmonically distinct that you simply know, okay, that must be Prokofiev. So every time you pick up a little puzzle and a little piece in the puzzle. But one thing I can tell you, that it was not a kind of a disastrous realization. Oh my God, I guess I don't have anything else I could do because now it's too late. It was a joy. It was always fun. It was always something I really wanted to do. I have a lot of friends who have been studying music, and a lot of my students who are literally coming to me and said, "Pablo, I have been studying music. I have done even my degrees and so on. Tell me, am I in the right profession?
Uh-huh.
Do I have?" And this is a kind of an incredibly complicated moment to witness or to be part of, because if you even have to ask that question, that means the answer probably is no.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
But it is. I've had these situations in my life where I have very accomplished people asking me, "Do you think I am in the right profession? Do you think I have any future? Should I?" And I said, it's one of those most amazing moments where you just don't know what to say, because
Yeah.
being honest is too brutal, but actually
Right.
at the same time, not being honest probably is even more brutal.
That's right. That's right. So it sounds like your father didn't force you into
Not
becoming a
at all.
musician.
Not at all.
That's the key. So
Well,
he
some people
cycle.
have been
Yeah.
chained to their piano benches, like Rachmaninoffs and Horowitz's or whatever, and beaten by their fathers,
Yeah.
and become some of the greatest musicians in the world. So it's very hard know what's. I mean, I prefer nobody beating anybody, but still, you know, it is better if you want to do it on your own. But somebody has to open the door, and somebody has to make it fun for you, and somebody has to make this universe so attractive to you that you simply want to be in it.
So a lot of times what I try and do in the book and I tell people is reaching the level of mastery, which you said you have reached maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you kind of realized something had changed. Do you think of it as kind of this incredibly pleasurable sensation? It's incredibly exciting and invigorating, and that's why you want to encourage other people to try and get to that same level. Do you feel that way?
I think that it is a kind of, you don't even know when it happens, but you have this feeling like, you know what, this I know how to do this piece. I know how these things should go, and it's not like, and it is not to be misunderstood. It's not like I know everything. By far not. I doubt everything. Every day I doubt
Right.
most of the musical choices, and God knows many other choices. But that's not about like I know everything kind of feeling.
No, I know.
Oh, it is not. But you have a feeling that I know what I'm doing. I know how to rehearse this piece so that the orchestra gets it. I know how to organize this rehearsal so that we get the maximum amount of work done quickly and are prepared within much shorter period of time than, let's say, I used to, used to do before. So it's a gradual feeling, but it's a feeling. Well, first of all, two sensations. One is that you feel you're getting old. And in a way, this is a very interesting thing because we live in this world where you have, this is like a great young conductor, there is no such thing. It is a contradiction in terms. There is, but we worship youth, and who doesn't? But and in Asian cultures, some older cultures worship always the elders. So you have this thing about incredible respect for elders. If you go to a Japanese orchestra,
right,
an old German conductor, that's where it's at. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They worship an old German conductor, and the thing is, because it's old, and the whole process is about experience, and in a way, I find it. I mean, it can also go too far, this thing, but in a way, I find that this is a more logical way of looking at our development rather than saying, well, somebody's 20 years old and he's like the greatest. Well, no, there's no such thing.
There is no such thing.
There is no such thing. It's just, because especially if you cannot measure the mastery in terms of sales or in terms of anything that is tangible.
Right. Well, the standard that they had used with the 10,000 hours when it came to music was something stood the test of time. Was this particular composition of Mozart that he composed at 16 that people loved at the time? Or do people still consider it sophisticated and interesting? The same with Shostakovich or any of the other composers. So they sort of used a time standard there.
Well, I think time is the gold standard for everything, because
right.
I mean, what's so interesting is that some of the pieces written in 1970s in new music, in the classical music, 1970s, they sound so dated now. Meanwhile,
some of it does.
Some of the music written in 1912 or something, 1915, by people like Stravinsky or
Scriabin,
sounds like it's written now, and you have somehow it is not dated, and it's a very interesting question.
It's very odd. I've noticed that myself as well.
It's time. Let's talk about power.
Okay.
Another subject that you have been so exploring in such detail, and it is an interesting thing from a point of view of our political world today, but also the power structures within art world, and how does the development one's development helped or hindered by the whole structure of power?
Well, I wrote my first book is called The 48 Laws of Power. It's sort of what launched my career as a writer. And basically, prior to that, I had been working in Hollywood in the film business. And it was a very frustrating experience for me because I came in with the illusion that the only thing that mattered was talent, was making a great film, was the creative process. And lo and behold, I had to discover that no, what really mattered was power. Was the producer feeling like he or she was the power person? The director was the person who was in control. And there were all these manipulative games going on that people were playing to sort of elevate their ego and make them feel like they were the bigger power player than the other person. And I felt very disillusioned. And I thought back on all of my other jobs, and I realized that this was kind of the same thing in other areas as well. It just was surprising that in a creative area it would be like that. So I wrote the book, and I wanted to show that it's not about power in the sense that we associate with great politicians playing all these big power games. No, it's a very human, deep seated need that we all have. The sense that you have no control over your life and that people don't recognize you and that people don't acknowledge you as somebody who is good or talented is deeply, deeply distressing to the human being. So, in every single aspect of life, we are craving some kind of power. We want to be able to influence our children. We want to be able to influence our boss. We want to be able to please the conductor so he will give us, better, more interesting pieces to perform, on and on and on. So we have this tremendous guilt about power. We think that it's something that we really shouldn't confess that we're interested in. And I find that deeply hypocritical. So I wrote the book to sort of show you, particularly people who are a bit naive about the power games that are going on in every area, to show you this is how powerful people are playing the game so that you can be more aware and have your eyes open before you get hurt.
Well, this subject for a musician, and especially a person who is working with uh, uh, large groups of people and organizations, and especially an interesting subject for also conductors, young conductors, especially who are getting into the business, because one of the things, and there are many things that one is not taught in the music schools, and in fact,
No, I wouldn't think so.
and one of the things is how to deal with people, and what are those important human qualities and strategic qualities also, which can help you develop your career. But power, for example, in purely musical terms, if you are inside the orchestra, it is a very interesting process, and incredibly different from one orchestra and one culture to another. If you look at an orchestra, basically it's a hierarchy based
Right.
Collective, and hierarchy is sort of broken down from, let's say, if we're talking about just the people on stage. So supposedly the conductor is on top of the list, and then there is a concertmaster. Each group has a leader, and so on. But then there are more important people in the orchestra who are not necessarily the best players, or even in the most important positions, who are often the leaders of the opinion leaders, so to speak, the ones who make the climate in the orchestra, who know how their voices can be heard and how to influence their colleagues, and generally get quietly behind the scenes done a lot of things which are incredibly instrumental and incredibly important. So if you look at, for example, an Asian orchestra like NHK, you have a culture that is so hierarchical
Right.
that I mean, people sometimes, I say to the second oboe a little bit more to the second player, and the second oboe player sometimes looks like this to the leader, and he's just, Okay, and then she dares to make a crescendo because within this particular group, there is an understanding that nobody plays louder than the first oboe, for example. And then you go to some orchestra, great orchestra like Orchestre de Paris, and basically nobody respects any power. Just friends have a love-hate relationship with authority to begin with.
Yeah, right.
But the minute there is nobody in charge, they hate it even more. So that is an incredible, how should I say, a navigation of where the power should look like a friendly suggestion, and when somebody expects you to put down your foot and say, "Do this," and the whole question of what you get, how do you get the best result in today's world? Not necessarily by demanding, but in my case, I always tell my friends and students, suggest something, invite musicians to play.
Can you give an example of some of the power games that you've had to play, particularly, let's say, with the Orchestre de Paris? Is there any kind of stories that come to mind of kind of sensitive things you had to do? And
well, the thing is that these are great orchestras who have great tradition, and they are really, I mean, I adore that orchestra, and so many of the decisions and so many things I learned from them by observing, not necessarily by the book kind of action that was going on. An Orchestre de Paris would never really follow, for example, they would always get around the kind of behind the screen policy. They would always know who they wanted in advance. It was always a quite political thing. There were many people who were influential in the orchestra, much more influential than the ones who on the paper had the power, and one of the things that I have learned is that, and this is something that maybe segues well into the next book you have written, but you get the best result by seducing. The art of seduction. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, vaguely, yes.
Vaguely, right. I thought so. And the thing with rehearsing and any orchestra really, but in Paris especially, and I love the Orchestre de Paris, is that there's a respect for nuance. There is a respect for something that makes ordinary into extraordinary. There is no real formula for that. And if they find that few times in a concert rehearsal something like this happens, they already start looking at you as somebody who is not a mere routinier, the time. And then if you also show that you are actually hearing and you can actually organize your time and so on, and then the biggest crucial moment always, and also this is the most scary for the very young conductors, is the orchestra also needs to see that you are willing to stand for your principles. And if something simply doesn't work, then you need to put your foot down and say, I'm sorry, but that's not good enough. And say it so that it is not devastating and doesn't create a World War III. If these qualities coincide, then you have a relationship or a beginning of that relationship. But it is an incredibly important word, and the word is seduction.
So you've had to learn a lot about how to deal with people and how to deal with their egos and how to, keep them motivated and keep and impress them as a leader. Is this something that you developed over time, or were you kind of born with that skill? Were you not so good at it 20 years ago?
Well, I'm better at it now.
Yeah.
But I think that most likely, and I am not 100% sure how accurate I can be here, but I think that there are people who are intuitively and naturally better at dealing with others, and there are sort of extrovert qualities, and others who are less good at it. but at the same time you learn. One of the things I can tell you about a story. When I was my first 10 years when I was conducting professionally, I was only conducting in Scandinavia.
Mm-hmm.
And Scandinavia is such a fantastic place in a way that there are so many orchestras, so much culture. Even every small town has an orchestra. So as a young conductor, you could be conducting, every week and doing a different repertoire and learning your craft. But of course, on a much more modest level. But people are the same. People are the same. Music's the same. And what I noticed as a young conductor, that all of us, of course, want to have acceptance, and people always want to be liked.
Right.
I noticed at one point that a strange pattern started occurring. Every time I would go to a small orchestra somewhere in Finland, usually after the first rehearsal, one of the older members, usually from Eastern Europe, either Czech or Polish, or one of the people who would play there, have played in this orchestra already for 30 years, would come in and you said, you are one of the most talented young conductors I have seen. You remind me, and usually they would say something like, you remind me of Arvid Jansson, who was the father of Maris Jansson. Wonderful. We don't get this kind of conductors here so often. I would like to invite you to dinner. My wife will cook some homemade. I know you're always in hotels. And I said, wonderful, very flattered and so on. Would go to a dinner. As a rule, that person would then show up next day and said, I have to leave in the middle of the break because I have either a funeral or a wedding, and never showed up before the dress rehearsal. And because I ate their food in their house,
right.
never say like, no, don't, because I don't know, maybe he's telling the truth. Yeah. So there was a point where I literally stopped taking invitations, and especially musician forms, because I knew that I felt that there was a pattern of these old guys simply using me and being so clever that you cannot say no to somebody after you go and their wife makes a wonderful meal for you. So there was these kind of lessons, but they happen in many different ways throughout the years. You learn a lot of about human nature.
Well, that is the art of seduction, what that person did on you. That is getting you to lower your guard by giving you some kind of pleasurable experience.
Absolutely.
And then, Well, one thing I say in Mastery, just to go back to Mastery, was I had a chapter in there about social intelligence. And the idea is that you think of mastering, let's say in music or whatever field, that it's mostly a technical thing. It's mostly like mastering your instrument and the music itself. And that's something you can do on your own and with lots of practice. But I try to say there's another element, which is the social element, that you could be the most talented musician in the world. But if you're really, really awkward with people, if you're very insecure and you have an incredible ego and you take everything too personally, if you don't know how to please other people, if you don't know how to work with a team, then all of your talent will be completely neutralized. All of your hard work won't matter.
That's
you
right.
have to also learn, part of your skill is the ability to work with other people, right? Do you find that true? Because I notice a lot of people who are very creative, very talented, that's not something that they're necessarily good at. And it's actually what ends up becoming an incredible limit to their career. It's like a wall that they can never pass through. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I went for 3 years. I studied in Curtis Institute of Music, and it's one of the greatest schools. And actually, it was a fantastic experience, which I cherish more than almost any other. And one of the traditions they had, which was a very funny tradition, and I didn't understand what was going on. I think it was Wednesday. I might be wrong, but 3 o'clock tea. And so everybody was supposed to go to the lobby of the school. The school was a wonderful old little townhouse, a very beautiful old world setting. And there was usually a wife of the president and maybe one of the older ladies from the board of the orchestra. there was a huge samovar type of tea kettle, and everybody was expected to go there. It was mandatory to go at 3 o'clock tea, and we would all stand up there, and people would talk, and I thought, what is going on? Why are we doing this every Wednesday? And then somebody who knew the tradition said, well, in the beginning, the school was created as a sort of incubator for very talented, exceptionally talented musicians. And very often what happened is that these kids had zero social skills. So the wife of the cimbalist, who actually was the creator of the school, used the 3 o'clock tea to identify the most awkward people.
Wow.
Stand there, not know, look away, not know what to do. And they would pick those kids and bring them home and teach them manners, how to use a knife and fork, how to use conversation, how to have some basic social skills. Because without those skills, you can be the greatest violinist in the world. Nothing's going to happen.
Right.
And that tradition happens there up until to this day. It is now, but it was done very, very pragmatically by the wife of the founder, who Mrs. Bock, who wanted to identify the most awkward, socially awkward people, so that we can help with that part of their life.
Well, you were never in that group, I imagine.
I wasn't. I have a very outgoing and flamboyant set of parents. Somehow, yes, I think that was always easy, that talking and communicating with people. But communicating in front of the orchestra is a different thing. It's a different thing because there is a almost inhuman mix of qualities that are expected of you, and basically none of these qualities would really look and convincing if you start thinking about them and if you are acting. And people, because musicians in orchestra are very intelligent and they can see through bullshit immediately. And so people who come in with a kind of, oh, I'm very important, they're out. The people who say like, I'm sorry, I hope I don't bother you too much, they're also out. I mean, the mix of this naturalness, ability to know, to what you are, what you want, but at the same time have charm. And in my case, I've learned the most important thing is, and I find it's in every aspect of every living aspect, it's a sense of humor. Without humor, I don't even know how it is possible. I see some people who just don't laugh, and I don't know how they're still alive.
I know.
How can you survive, and how can you get anywhere if you can't just laugh?
Also be able to laugh at yourself as well, and have some self-deprecating humor.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, that is something that I find is such a door opener. If one good job and one small nuance, and the musicians just immediately say, okay, that's a human being. And that is so crucial. But how are you going to teach that? You cannot teach. This is not something that you can encourage somebody to relax and make a joke. But how can you, how can you encourage more than that? It's very difficult for a young student.
Right. I noticed that a lot of the power games that I've had to deal with don't necessarily come from colleagues, etc., like the members of an orchestra. They come from the producers, the people with money, the financiers, the backers of the project, because they're the ones with the biggest egos, and they're the ones that need to be, they have a great deal of envy of the creative types. And so therefore they're kind of playing all these kind of weird power games. They're trying to meddle and prove that they're actually it's not just about money, that they have other skills. Do you find that's true as well in the music world, or?
I find that there is a strong cases of this. that I've noticed in my life. What sometimes happens is that there could be a conflict between orchestra manager or a director of the orchestra and an artistic director or a musical director, because there are a lot of directors in these organizations. There are 25 people whose title is preceded by the word vice. And the person who said be always wary of anybody whose title has a word vice in front of it. But the truth is that they are all important people, and they're all people who actually doing their job, and many of them great. And so then who is more important? Is usually this is a kind of a very limiting, a kind of mind-numbing question. Who is more important? You're not going anywhere. You're not going to get anything done or accomplish anything if you want to be more important or look or appear more important. A lot of things who was this a great politician who said how many great things can be done if you don't put your name on the project or you give a credit to somebody else. And in a way, that's important. One of the things that I wanted to just to say, because this question is actually very interesting, this whole power thing. I'm not gonna even. Well, maybe it's interesting to talk a little bit about the power, about the current situation. But before that, if you're a young musician, somebody offers you a job, you take it.
Right.
Because that's the way the business works. And in the beginning, you said, "Look, you want to be a music director of this orchestra?" I said, "Yeah." That's what I always dreamed about. And then because you don't know how it all works, and then you realize that you might have a fantastic orchestra and you think that you're doing very well, but you don't have any contact with the orchestra manager, for example. Or you could have a wonderful orchestra manager and a wonderful working relationship, but you don't have any contact with, let's say, a leader or a concert master of the orchestra. Or perhaps everything works, but your orchestra organization doesn't have enough money to have all these ideas that you to bring them to life. Or you have enough money, but somebody who is in charge of that money doesn't have enough ambition. And so all these things, and finding this incredibly important trio of somebody, of real team, of somebody who believes in you, who you trust, and with whom you have a mutual vision, a mutual set of values. I think that's really the only way to get anywhere. So who is more powerful is already from the beginning on a very damaging question.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for failure. Speaking of power, what is happening? What is, in your opinion, which leaders are the best right now or worst at dealing with the crisis?
Well, I make the point in my last book, The Laws of Human Nature, that normally people are good at disguising their weaknesses and their flaws. We all learn how to wear a mask and present ourselves as being more intelligent, more competent than is generally the reality. And that it takes a crisis or a real difficult problem in our life or some kind of failure or setback. That's when someone's true character shows up. All of our weaknesses are suddenly revealed.
Right.
And so in this moment, I think this is kind of revealing the leaders who shows, and it's interesting to me, a lot of the leaders right now who are kind of proving themselves dealing with the pandemic are women. So I think Angela Merkel has been actually quite brilliant in dealing with it, and her poll numbers are through the roof in that. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, whose name escapes me right now, she's been doing a magnificent job. South Korea, you might disagree with their politics, but they have done a great job in keeping the coronavirus under control, and that's another woman in charge. I don't know if there's any, if there's any correlation between all of that, but the thing that matters for a leader is, particularly in a time of crisis, to be shown to have a vision and to be a unifying force and to not play politics and to say, all right, I'm going to base my decision on what is the most rational, on what will lead to the best outcomes. And in my book, I sort of hold up as the paradigm of this the ancient Greek leader of Pericles, who was one of the greatest leaders ever in history. And Athens was continually going through these very tumultuous periods and these crises. And he always thought, what is the greater good of Athens? What is most important for the largest number of people in our democracy? And so I think leaders now who can demonstrate that they can take responsibility, that they're not trying to blame other people, they're not trying to blame China or Europe or the United States. They take responsibility. They're out there working harder than everyone else. And they also have a vision for how we're going to get out of this crisis. For what will Germany be like in a year or two? What is the exit strategy here? Because I think people in time like this, we all feel very uncertain and very anxious. And we want a leader who's almost like a parent figure that will calm us down and will show that they are in charge, that they understand, what the larger vision is. And so, I mean, obviously I could say who's not rising to the occasion. And I think people are sophisticated out there enough to know who I'm talking about, particularly the president of the United States, who I'd put extremely low in that category. He's almost the counterexample of what you want from a leader in a time like this. But those are sort of the qualities that I think are important. What do you think?
Well, I want to come back. I agree with you absolutely. The thing that you said, and something that I always have thought, and it's going back to this whole business of women leaders, because it was way before any of the crises and stuff. I mean, we always discussed with friends and politically minded friends about leaders and the world order, so to speak. And I don't know. I have always, for a long time now, thought that one of the greatest and simplest ways to fix our world, in a way, is to have more female leaders. I mean, but truly on a high place. I'm not talking about. I mean, no disrespect meant. I mean, Estonia, my wonderful Estonia, we have a female president, a wonderful president, but it's Estonia, and Estonia, relatively speaking, is not exactly wielding the power. But if countries like Germany, Italy, America, UK, and so on, the really, really strong and influential cultures would have a set of leaders with a set of values that puts the country first, that puts the real issues first. And I also find that there is a certain humanity that one identified. And now we get into a very tricky subject, thin ice here, because saying that women have more empathy and more sort of intuitive sense for a care might be also seen as some sort of a sexist comment, but I can't see any of that empathy coming from our great leaders right now, who are kind of look like cartoon characters and
right.
Just don't even have empathy is not the one word that you can identify.
No.
So I do think that world needs and would change dramatically for better if we would have a female, more powerful and just many more female leaders on a high level. I'm dealing with that issue very interestingly also within our profession, because we are going through an incredibly important period now. Kind of the game changer now is that female conductors are now the thing that is not only accepted but encouraged, and there is a very strong group of young female conductors who are basically coming into this super male dominated field. But at the same time, it's all a question of leadership. I mean, if we can have a female president, why can't we have a female conductor? So in a way, and classical music by its nature is so conservative that most inside the organizations are still not as comfortable always as they should be. But that's very much now part of the new climate that we're dealing with, which is a very interesting thing because it makes a lot of people uneasy, including a lot of women in the orchestra. This is one of the things that nobody wants to talk about, but very often females in the orchestra can be quite critical of the female conductors.
Oh, really?
And therefore, there is this sort of black and white paradigm of like chauvinist men don't let women on the podium. Equation doesn't always hold water, especially now. But it's a very interesting moment that the conducting profession is going through. And
wow, that's interesting.
But it's a very necessary.
Yeah, it's very positive. Yeah, and one other quality that I didn't mention, empathy, as you said, is extremely important. And the other thing is that a leader should be also looking forward and foreseeing problems that are going to be coming up down the road. So, for instance, there have been warning voices up and down the line about pandemics and about being prepared and so things are looking good right now in the present, like they were before the coronavirus, and the stock market was doing great here in the United States. But a real leader is looking forward and seeing the problems that have not yet become so extreme and preparing for them in advance. And I know some countries, particularly in Asia, were just so much better prepared for this. They were taking it seriously and they understood the steps that needed to be taken in advance. I'm speaking specifically about South Korea and Taiwan, and they're coming out of this much better than the United States is. So that's another quality. It's about the quality that I'm talking about is having an overall vision of the future and thinking ahead and thinking about the problems that aren't necessarily right there in the moment. That's one other quality that I think is extremely important.
But this thing actually comes again now from a basic education. If you are an educated person with a large range and culture person, one of the interesting things about education and culture is that in order to be in an old times, a culture was part of education. In other words, if you were considered educated person, that means you are considered a person who part of it meant that you are also a cultured person.
Right.
Now there are a lot of, the whole Washington is full of just super intelligent and educated people who are not cultured, and so the decisions that they make have no cultural background, and they don't have a cultural understanding of the consequences. And in general, it's a very interesting thing. One cannot know everything.
No.
If you are not smart enough to surround yourself with people who actually know and are experts on these issues, then how can you rule the world?
Right.
And meanwhile, if you keep firing people who are experts, but you don't agree with them, that how can you come up with an intelligent solution to anything? So to me, what's happening is so surreal right now.
It is.
But the question of culture is very interesting because at the end of the day, I know that you, and I read a lot about your background, and you were traveling the world, and you did I don't know how many different jobs before you actually found your calling and did as you saw the world. Part of the culture, part of the whole sense of understanding the globality of what's around us you need to go to places. You need to see the rest of the world and not say we are the greatest country in the world. This absurd thing saying we are the greatest country in the world without any sort of reference to anything is funny, and it's sad, and
it's very dangerous as well. For me, as part of it also is an understanding of history. So I'm someone who reads a lot of history research for my books. And when you read a lot of history, you understand that things that we're going through now are not necessarily exceptional or unique. They've happened before in the past, that there are certain patterns that things keep recurring. So, for instance, the fact that there are always these financial bubbles that occurred, like the one the great led to the great crash of 2008. And I thought that if the coronavirus hadn't occurred, we were actually headed towards another financial crisis as well. And that's
Mhm.
not without even the coronavirus. But these things keep recurring over and over and over again. You mentioned about traveling. And when I was 21, I graduated college. The first thing I did is I went to Europe and I lived there for 2 years. I hitchhiked all around. I did many different kinds of jobs. Um, and it taught me basically what it taught me was a sense of humility. It was a sense that I come from a place that has a history that goes back a couple hundred years. But these cultures, like in France and Spain and Greece, they're incredibly profound and incredibly rich. And it put things in perspective. And it made me realize that I need to be a little bit more humble about where I come from, about what I know. And so some of these leaders that we have now, they don't read history. They don't have, as you say, a cultural background. It creates a very kind of narrow perspective. And, I think we're suffering tremendous consequences for that.
Yeah, a country that is 200 years old is just power playing a country of thousands of years old, like China, simply on
Right.
the current military might and economic might. It seems very ill thought through. It seems like
Well,
no real a real thought behind it.
well, the Chinese are masters of strategy, and they've had a history that goes, as you say, thousands of years. It's the country that produced Sun Tzu. They understand that power is a game of time. They're playing for time, and they have a vision, whether we like it or not, of where their country will be in 5 or 10 years. And they used to call it soft power. They want to have a kind of a soft power where they slowly emerge as the great power in the world, but they're going to do it slowly through a process. So when you have a country thinking that far ahead, that strategic, that immersed in the culture of Sun Tzu, facing someone who can't think past the moment, who's always reacting, whose ego is constantly getting in the way, you tell me which side is going to prevail in the end.
Yeah,
I know where I would put my money.
yeah. What is your next book about?
Well, so I always kind of take the subject for my next book from something in the previous book. And in the last book, I have a chapter about confronting our mortality. I call it the sublime. And the idea is that probably the greatest fear that we humans have is obviously of our death, and that we're very conscious of it. And so the degree that you're denying or repressing this one reality that we can all agree upon is going to sort of define you. But that confronting our mortality and confronting this is actually an incredibly powerful psychological moment. And I call it the sublime. And so my next book is about what I call the sublime. And the idea is that human life, um, culture, politics, etc., social life is based on kind of limits to us. These are the limits of we define reality based on kind of a circle. This is what we all agree is reality in a Western culture. This is how politics should be run. This is how music should be composed. And the sublime is something that lies just beyond that circle. It's something that people aren't thinking about. It's something that is beyond those limits. And death is the ultimate sublime because it is beyond the circle of life itself. And so confronting the sublime is an incredibly, incredibly invigorating experience. And I had it personally happen to me because about a year and a half ago, I had a very close brush with death. I had a stroke, and I came within a couple of inches of dying or having severe brain damage. And that moment was incredibly powerful because I had written about it 2 months before in my book, but it was sort of an abstract intellectual concept. And now it was very real and very visceral. And that confrontation of that moment outside the circle with death itself made me suddenly incredibly appreciative of the smallest thing in life. Just hearing the birds and the sounds outside my window and knowing that I came very close to never seeing or hearing them again. Just knowing that I would never be able to have conversations or do things ever again makes me deeply, deeply grateful for everything that I have. And I'm worried that people nowadays are so locked in a narrow little world, a narrow banal world that they get on social media, etc., and they're not confronting this other realm outside the circle. And music is going to be a very important part of this book because I'm a deep lover of classical music. As you know, I also like jazz as well. Um, and I'm very fascinated by what I would consider the sublime in music. So I have certain composers and certain genres who are kind of my stars in that realm.
Who
But
are
I
they?
think, well, I list kind of two kinds of sublime in music. So there's the kind of immediate sublime, which comes from music that's so overpowering. You know, we can think in an obvious sense, like Handel's Messiah, for instance. It's so overpowering that when you actually listen to it, you can't help but feel it with welling within you. You can't even start crying. It's so powerful that nobody can resist it. It has an immediacy, an effect like that. And so there are other compositions you can maybe point to, the Ode to Joy or something like that as well. And then to me, there's the more conscious sublime, where it's the composer is literally trying to create a new kind of sound. And so the traditional definition of the sublime is something that mixes pleasure and pain. It's a very unusual kind of experience in which you feel a moment of fear, but then you also experience, wow, I have nothing really to be afraid of. There's something great out there. It's awesome. But it also gives you a touch of fear. So music that combines that pleasure and pain element, that has elements of dissonance in it, that never quite resolves itself, is to me very sublime. And I think the first composer that did that consciously was Beethoven. And there are people who've written about, for instance, the Fifth Symphony as one of the first examples of music that refused to resolve itself, that kept leading a sense of suspense, but never quite got you back home. And people who heard that at the time thought it was the worst bit of chaotic noise they had ever heard in their lives. And now, you know, look at it now. But I also consider Scriabin, who's one of my favorite composers, as deeply, deeply sublime. Um, I think some things of Shostakovich, although most people wouldn't associate with them. I've been listening.
No, I see that, and I also,
It,
for me, also Mahler. For me,
oh,
Mahler,
Mahler, certainly.
the Ninth Symphony, the ending of
Ninth,
the last moment of Ninth, that's sublime.
and also even the 10th Symphony. I don't know, many people don't know about the 10th Symphony, but the Ninth Symphony most definitely. Um, and then, you know, yesterday, and it wasn't by coincidence because I like him a lot. I was listening to Arvo
Parrot.
Pärt. I didn't know how to pronounce that part. And some of that music is very, very sublime,
That's
right? And then I tell you, the last thing is I went to see the Los Angeles Philharmonic. David Donnelly was very nice to get me like a pass where I got to meet Dudamel afterwards. But he conducted Scriabin's Poem of Ecstasy. And that is one of the most sublime things anyone could ever experience, to see that live. It was utterly breathtaking. So those are sort of in my pantheon. I don't know if you have anybody else you would add.
No, but I mean, these composers, of course, there are, you know, one of the amazing things about classical music is that there are 400 years of music being written, you know, and the fact is that I mean, I have friends who ask me, younger friends who ask me about the rock stars who were bigger than Jesus, you know, bigger 20 years ago, and they simply are not. Young generation doesn't know them anymore.
Right.
There are composers who wrote music 300 years ago, and we still go to a concert to listen to them, and still are moved by it. So as we started in the beginning of our conversation, this standing and withstanding the test of time. I mean, that's an ultimate judge, you know.
Right.
That's an ultimate judge. If you survive 300 years and people still want to listen and feel something, that's something. You know, that is something that cannot be measured in any dollar signs or any sort of immediate currency. How do you want to remembered, speaking of afterlife and sublime, that outside of the circle, after uh, after you have finished that journey, how do you want people to remember you? Have you thought about that?
Well, I think about it all the time. I'm very obsessed because as someone who reads a lot of history, I'm also obsessed with the future, and I'm also obsessed with my legacy. And so I'm often thinking as I write what I write, what will people in 100 years be thinking about this? So two things. I always try to make what I'm writing timeless. So I'm not sitting here writing about events that are going on in 2018. I'm deeply, deeply rooted in things that go back thousands of years, back to our prehistory even, so that when people in 100 years are reading my books, they don't have the sense of, oh, that is so 2018. That is so dated. That I want them to think this is timeless. When you pick up something, I'm not comparing myself to them, don't get me wrong, but when you pick up Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War, it's timeless. It's like he's writing about human nature, about people, and what he's describing about the battle with Sparta, between Athens and Sparta, is just as relevant to anything happening now. So that's one element I want, and the other element is that this is someone who is extremely realistic. I'm not trying to flatter the reader. So Mastery is, I consider, kind of a painful book because I'm saying there are no shortcuts to mastery. You Everyone loves to have shortcuts. They want an app. They want some kind of pill they can take. And no, it's boring, it's tedious, it requires a lot of work, a lot of dedication. But that's the reality. This is how you really get there. I'm not going to bullshit you with these kind of quick formulas for success. It's going to take you years because I believe in actually giving really practical, realistic advice. So if people 100 years from now are going, yeah, that still is true. That still applies to what I'm doing. That's very real. That I couldn't ask for anything more. That's sort of what I think. How about yourself? Yeah.
As a writer, you have one great advantage is that you write a book, and that book, well, up until now, we had libraries. I don't know what's going to happen soon afterwards, but at least they will be in some sort of database, library is a better word, where one can go back and refer to it, and there is an evidence on the paper or on the screen that you existed, that you had a thought, that
Right.
your thoughts were interesting, and then time will judge are they relevant or not. Musicians, the sad part, but also maybe fascinating part, a lot of the music that has been made by some of the greatest musicians in the world, we are talking about people, Beethovens and Mozarts and Haydns and even Mahlers and so on. We can never tell how the concerts that they conducted or played, how Paganini sounded. We don't know.
No.
We can just say, okay, well, Liszt was supposed to be the great pianist, greatest of
Right.
we don't know how he sounded. We don't know a lot of things. We just sort of reinterpret because the book exists and we have the score. And in a way, now the classical musicians are in a much more advantageous position, because one thing that they do leave behind is the recorded performances.
Right.
And videos and whatever. We actually can go back and see, look, Bernstein actually conducted these pieces. And he started making videos way before it was a big thing in classical music, because he was just similarly obsessed about his legacy. He wanted people to be able to see him conduct Shostakovich symphony, which is something that you don't have with some of the other great conductors. So this leaving the legacy, I think, is also part of this desperate need to not totally drop off the face of Earth without leaving a mark.
What do you think about? Are you worried at all about the future of classical music? Because as someone who grew up with it and has such an intense love for it, I go now to concerts, and it's mostly an old crowd. You know, I hate to say it. Um, you occasionally see some young people in there, but I'm a little worried about 20, 30 years from now. This will orchestras survive? Will people still be able to appreciate some of these great timeless pieces of music as I have been able to?
I think that, I mean, this is literally a subject that in my circles we are talking about almost daily. And these are the issues that every orchestra manager, every orchestra uh, uh, is discussing and trying to somehow find a way forward. And I am not worried. I'll tell you, I'm not worried about the classical music itself because we have,
No,
because this classical music is not just music. Classical music is actually history. It's actually just history written in a different form. If you listen
right.
to another symphony, you might as well be reading a book about that time period, but it's also a book about
That's right.
the human nature. It's about all the inner, most intimate turbul- turbulences and thoughts. And so it is so strong and it is so valid and it's so much part of our culture that it's part of being human for me. Having said that, you're right, and I think especially in the United States, the audiences are getting older and older and older, and the the audiences in Europe are not always getting older. Well,
Oh,
some of the biggest and youngest audiences now are in Korea, for example,
oh, that's
and
great.
other Asian countries are there's a very different statistics because the center of classical music is shifting from Europe or especially to America to Asia. So there is always a balance. I find the reason why in United States I think it is getting older because the country and the country American culture doesn't embrace arts.
No,
It's
no,
it's already kind of a niche and it's very difficult to get to you know convince people in power and leadership positions that culture is not just a kind of icing on the cake or a nice evening out, but it is actually essential for development and
yeah,
development as a human being. But um, the other thought I have is that that art form, in a way, has always been a niche art form. Classical music was always, I mean, we use the word in a very negative way now, elitist, right? And it's not really a great way of describing classical music, but the whole elite and this image of it being only for well-educated, rich, well-to-do group of people who can understand all of this is a very negative thing, and in the United States, it's often used as a reason
I
not to
know.
encourage it. Um, uh, the other thought I have about it is that you know it's not meant for kids. And let
No,
me let me explain it. I mean, I was a kid and I loved classical music, and I still do, and a lot of kids love it. But the thing is that if you are a parent and if you are 30 years old, that means that your father already and your grandfather even thinks of classics as Elvis or Sinatra.
right, 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 right.
If you ask about classics, they don't talk about Mozart. They're talking about Elvis.
Yeah.
They're
Or the
talking
Beatles.
about the Beatles exactly. So as a kid, you want to go crazy. You have all this energy and you of course you go to rock concerts. You do all kind of things. You experiment, and then you have kids, and you're not gonna bring your 2-year-old to a concert, a punk rock concert or whatever concert, because fun as it may be, it's just not the right thing for the kid. And you start saying, what am I going to introduce to my kid that is good for him or her? Something that she can learn from, something that could develop. And then all of a sudden, there is classical music, nutcrackers, and you start, and slowly you go and start looking for more enlightened alternatives. And in a way, it is very logical and very normal for somebody at 40 all of a sudden being more drawn to classical music, and at 50 being truly into it because they understand their complexities and so on. It's like nobody drinks Chateauneuf de Pape when they are in college, unless you are a billionaire. You drink shit beer and you like it. And then slowly you say, look, I want to, you discover that.
I agree.
So in a way, just like we get to a good wine, we're going to get to classical music. In some ways, I'm not so desperate and so negative about it.
That's
On
good.
the other hand, I am worried that the general looking down on anything cultural and looking as if it is just a waste of money, of taxpayers' money, and the whole idea that if it doesn't pay for itself, then it's not really necessary.
Yeah, right.
Idea that, of course, is killing American classical music, and that means we are super reliant on corporate sponsorship and also all the sponsorship and big money. And then comes a moment like now when everybody's losing their fortunes, and guess what? The donations are going to grow, and it's going to, so the trickle down thing doesn't really work.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're more or less the same age. I think I'm a couple of years older than you. But I remember when I was a kid, the first time I heard, my parents got me all the Beethoven symphonies. I think it was Herbert von Karajan, the 9 symphonies. And, I was listening to rock music. I was listening to The Who, etc. But this was so powerful. When you're a kid, you want those kind of emotional experiences, right? You want to be sort of taken out of yourself. And when people have this idea that classical music is this kind of people wearing wigs, playing this kind of era, I'm telling you, if you like heavy metal music, listening to a Mahler symphony live is 80 times more powerful, or Shostakovich, not just the Symphony Number 5, but go listen to Symphony Number 7, for God's sake, or some of the other ones. It'll blow you away. It's 80 times more potent than anything you can get from heavy metal music. But I just feel like young people they don't realize the incredible rich emotional experiences you can get from classical music.
But somebody needs to open that door. Somebody needs to listen, let me take you by the hand and let's go to a concert. Because otherwise, in a peer pressure, it's like, it's not cool, and this and that. Somebody has to open the door, and that's why, of course, there is no better guide than a parent. Somebody, not just a teacher. The teacher is also important, but if it is somebody who is in your house, I mean, you can't beat that. And the idea, the classical music, which always infuriates me, said, "Oh, I like classical music; it's so relaxing." Are you crazy?
Oh God!
A heart attack from some of that music.
Try listening to Penderecki and see how relaxing that is.
That relaxing Rite of Spring,
Yeah, exactly.
So it is. But I mean, I also used to play in a rock band when I was younger, and I loved all of that stuff. And so for me, it's never a question of either or.
No.
It is everything that's good can be combined. But what do you think? And I know that you have you are kind of a cult figure with all the great rappers, all the rap gurus are reading your books, and being a big Shostakovich lover, as I can now find out, being a big guru for somebody like 50 Cent and Drake, and what how do you combine these two worlds? I mean, what is your next show? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Drake is
yeah.
And what is it?
Well, I've it's something that I've loved. I lived in New York in the early '80s, and that's when rap was first taking off. And I
Right.
got into it. I got very excited about it because it was very new, and I loved groups like Run DMC and Grandmaster Flash and that whole thing.
Mhm.
So I'm not as I hate to use the word stuffy as some people might think because I like you. I loved rock music and jazz. But I was very surprised to find that my books were hugely popular in the hip hop world. I mean, since then, I can kind of understand why. I didn't intend it that way, but I was very honored and happy about it. And I've met a lot of the top rappers, including 50 Cent, who I did a book with. Um, and then I met Drake a couple years ago, and these people are more sophisticated musically than you might think. Like Drake does listen to classical music, and I was surprised to know that 50 was a great lover of some of Beethoven's symphonies. He was a huge fan of the Symphony Number 5, for instance, and he I mean used it in one of his commercials for vitamin water, etc. But so I can appreciate the music. It's not my first choice, but there's some rappers who I like. But Drake was somebody who I met who's a big fan of the 48 Laws of Power. You see, unlike the classical music world, popular music is an extremely Machiavellian environment. The music industry, the producers of music, are so power hungry. They are so interested in making big money and exploiting artists. And in America, no artist was more exploited than Black musicians traditionally. If you read the history of even people like Duke Ellington or the great Charlie Parker, who I'm going to be writing about in my next book, they were massively exploited. Incredible Machiavellian power games going on. And people like 50 and Drake would tell me that all of the things they had learned on the streets did not prepare them for these power games
Right.
going on in the music industry. And so they found my book extremely helpful in navigating this very, very tricky environment. So Drake and I met, and he loves the 48 Laws of Power. He claims that it really sort of saved his ass, so to speak, at a critical moment in his career. And so we're working together to create a television version of the 48 Laws of Power.
Wow.
Don't
Cool.
ask me exactly what that will be because we're working on it right now, but it's for a new platform called Quibi, which I won't bore the audience here about what that is. But basically, it's to kind of create the visual equivalent of that book.
Mhm.
So that's sort of my history with rap artists. But I
So
have tremendous respect for them.
basically illustrating these laws with real life stories, I suppose.
Well, sort of it. They want to do what's called an anthology series. So it's going to be a mix of tellings of some things being actual stories in the book.
Mhm.
So, maybe we will recreate the famous story of Louis the 14th and his finance minister Fouquet, which is the first story in the 48 Laws of Power. Or maybe we'll use something that's more current that happened in 10 years ago in the financial industry. We're not sure. It's kind of an open book right now, but we want to give the feel of the book. We want to give the feel of the dangerousness of naivete, which is one of my big themes, that
Well, I think, yeah.
more problems occur in this world from people being naive. And that's why the power people in this world can do so many bad, dastardly things. It's because they prey on those who are less aware and less sophisticated and who are more naive. So I want to bring out these themes in the show, however we do it. I think it's going to be a mix of different kinds of stories.
I wouldn't be surprised if your next big group of followers and admirers is going to be a group called Young Conductors. Why?
Oh, wow.
Because this book could easily help quite a few young musicians who are getting into a classical music business, which has its own trappings and
I'm
Machiavellian.
sure.
So if the classical music readership is going to be high on your list, it came from here.
Okay, I'm very appreciative of that. I told you yesterday when we first talked that when we were first trying to do the 48 Laws of Power as a television series, one of the people, this is back in I think 2007, had the idea of setting it in an orchestra, that it would be a series where you'd have recurring characters, but it would take place in all of the power games in an orchestra. And I love the idea, and we tried to develop it, but the producers in Hollywood just didn't get it. They thought that was too weird.
The reason they didn't get it is because they don't know what orchestra is, because probably that generation already is not so able to understand what the orchestra really is, and they don't grow and live it. But orchestra is a perfect microcosm for this particular
I'm sure
subject, because the mind games, the power games, the whole dynamic of influence, and all the things that are verbal and non-verbal. And
yeah,
the classical concert, is not a verbal experience. So even within the performance, not to say about rehearsal as well, there are so many interesting things and powerful things that shape the dynamic of what the good performance, or how the good orchestra develops, or what could ruin a performance. Just struggle and lack of leadership, and giving the power into the wrong hands, or not knowing when to step in at the moment when really everybody needs somebody to be as a kind of a clear-cut leader. So I am sorry that it doesn't take place in the orchestra.
Well, maybe in the future, you and I will get together and we will create that series, or we will create a book. I would love to hear about your lessons in power and leadership. It would be a very interesting book there.
This is a very interesting idea. I would love to talk to you about.
Okay.
And wonderful to talk to you. I think
very nice talking to you.
A nice way to end our first conversation. But it's
I think so.
Pleasure, and very inspiring.
Same here, Pavel. Very much. Thank you so much for this pleasure. I hope we meet someday in person.
I hope so.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.